This week on The Inside Story, policies of deterrence. Leaders from the world's wealthiest economies meet in Hiroshima, Japan. What came from the annual G7 summit? And what is the symbolism of the venue? Plus, Ukraine's president draws parallels between World War II and what's happening in his country. Now, The Inside Story, policies of deterrence.
U.S. President Joe Biden's trip to the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan was an exercise in juggling priorities. President Biden made a quick trip to the summit, while administration officials finalized and signed defense agreements with the Pacific island nation of Papua New Guinea. The agreement gives the U.S. access to shipping lanes in the region and allows for a stronger military presence to counter China's growing strength in the region. But Biden also took the opportunity to make clear that the U.S. will continue to support Ukraine against Russian aggression. All this while the White House and Congress remain deadlocked over a plan to raise the nation's debt ceiling. White House diplomacy on two fronts. On this Inside Story. With the G7 summit now complete, takeaways from the three-day conference revolve around China's rising military and economic security threats, along with continued support for Ukraine. VOA's White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara accompanied President Biden on this trip to Hiroshima and has this report.
As G7 leaders conclude their three-day summit in Hiroshima, Japan, with a denunciation of China's rising military and economic security threats, U.S. President Joe Biden sought to reassure Beijing that the group does not seek conflict. At the same time, he issued a warning for China not to invade Taiwan.
There is clear understanding among most of our allies that, in fact, if China were to act unilaterally, there would be a response.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a surprise appearance at the summit, invited by G7 host Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida.
By inviting President Zelensky to Japan, we demonstrated the unwavering solidarity of the G7 with Ukraine, and the G7 reaffirmed the importance of the free and open international order based on the rule of law.
Zelensky met G7 and other invited leaders, including Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who has refused to condemn Russia's invasion. Zelensky thanked the G7 for agreeing to provide U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine and for their decision to train Ukrainian pilots to fly them.
I'm very happy. Thank you very much. Thanks to our partners. It really will help our society, our people, to save houses, families.
In a sign of warming relations between America's two closest allies in Asia, on the summit sidelines, Biden met with Kishida and President Yoon Suk-yeol, the leader of South Korea. They discussed North Korea's nuclear threat and China's rising assertiveness, two regional threats that have aligned the three countries closer.
I hope South Korea and Japan will have stronger cooperation on issues on the global agenda like economic security.
Biden returned to Washington Sunday to deal with negotiations on raising the U.S. debt ceiling to avoid the country going into default. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News, Hiroshima.
While G7 leaders recently met in Japan, it was U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken making a rare visit to the southwestern Pacific island of Papua New Guinea. The two countries signed a pair of security deals as part of Washington's broader efforts to counter China's influence in the region. But that likely means sustained engagement from the United States, as the island nation says climate change tops its list of concerns. VOA's Bill Gallo reports from Seoul.
Under the new agreements, U.S. forces can access airfields and ports in Papua New Guinea. The U.S. also pledged tens of millions of dollars to boost security cooperation. The deals will be fully transparent, vowed top U.S. diplomat Antony Blinken.
We are deeply invested in the Indo-Pacific because our planet's future is being written here. And Papua New Guinea is playing a critical role in shaping that future.
Blinken's visit is the latest attempt to show U.S. commitment to a region with growing Chinese influence. But the mood of the visit was dampened. U.S. President Joe Biden in Japan for the G7 summit had planned to make the first ever trip to Papua New Guinea by a sitting U.S. president, as well as a stop in Sydney. Instead, Biden headed home to deal with negotiations over raising the U.S. borrowing limit. A major disappointment, says Australia-based analyst Joe Siracusa.
Look, nobody in the world of diplomacy likes to be overlooked. And the fact that these countries take about 6 months preparation, for a presidential visit, it's a big deal.
Papua New Guinea had declared a public holiday for Biden's visit. Instead, it welcomed several other heads of state Monday. White House official John Kirby told VOA last week Biden's visit to Papua New Guinea may be rescheduled. But for many in the region, the big worry is whether Washington political chaos will hamper sustained U.S. focus on Asia. Many also fear an overly militarized approach to the region, says Siracusa.
They want the United States to do something about climate change. They think they're sinking under the water, and many of them are, while the United States doesn't do much about climate change.
But alongside Blinken on Monday, Papua New Guinea officials praised the deal with the United States, saying it would boost the country's national defense during a time of growing global uncertainty. Bill Gallo, VOA News, Seoul, South Korea.
The United States and New Guinea governments have agreed to a security pact that will give the U.S. vital access to the Indo-Pacific region. As China and the U.S. compete for influence in the Pacific, State Department officials say the structure of this deal will improve security cooperation, strengthen Papua New Guinea's defense, and boost regional stability. VOA's Ahadian Utama has the report from Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea.
U.S. President Joe Biden has shifted attention to the Pacific over concerns about China's increasing influence in the region, as Beijing has been giving diplomatic and financial assistance to some Pacific nations. Papua New Guinea Prime Minister James Marape says agreements with Washington that focus on defense cooperation and maritime matters will be formally signed after parliamentary approval.
Now we're elevating to a specific defense cooperation agreement, something that is falling short of a treaty. And so this has been an ongoing work for some time. The conversation has been running for the last 5, 6, 7 years. We've now looked into the importance of USA, PNG stepping up in our own relationship.
The defense and maritime agreements will allow the U.S. access the waters near the sea routes to Australia and Japan. In return, Papua New Guinea will gain access to U.S. satellite surveillance.
The shipwright agreement, for instance, allows for us to have a working partnership with U.S. Navy and U.S. Coast Guard. With the U.S. Coast Guard, it now gives us an opportune time to have access, not just on maritime access, but satellite access to illegal fishing, drug traffickers, illegal loggers, and all those illegal transportations and activities that happens on high sea.
Elias Wahengu, Papua New Guinea Foreign Affairs Secretary, led the negotiation and says the pact will not prevent Papua New Guinea from engaging with other nations.
We are within the ambit of the foreign policy perspective of Papua New Guinea. Friends to all, enemies to none. This agreement does not in any way preclude PNG from engaging with another nation in a future defense cooperation agreement.
Analyst says this pact will raise concerns over U.S.-China rivalry in the region and potentially put Pacific Island nations in the middle of U.S.-China tension. In 2022, the Solomon Islands agreed to sign a security pact with China.
Obviously, there comes a point where one has to be careful if those different external players reach heightened levels of tension, and PNG and its neighbors can be caught in the midst of it.
U.S. Secretary of State arrived in Papua New Guinea on Monday and is to sign the agreements at the Forum for Indo-Pacific Islands Cooperation, or FIPIC, summit in Port Moresby. Ahadian Utama, VOA News, Papua New Guinea.
As we've seen, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was a special invited guest to this year's G7 summit. The wartime president met with his counterparts and biggest backers in Ukraine's efforts to oust Russian forces. Zelensky seized the opportunity in Hiroshima to draw parallels with what's happening in Ukraine. Here he is in his own words.
The pictures of ruined Hiroshima really remind me Bakhmut and other similar settlements and towns. Just the same, nothing alive left. All of the buildings have been ruined. There is no understanding where the street is, where the house used to be. This is just a total destroyed area. Nothing left, not a single person left. Because I could see the picture where there was only a shadow left of a human being who was just sitting and nothing was left. Only the fully incinerated life. This is the tragedy itself. The shadow which Putin wanted our country to look like. I found such an association. I do apologize for that. But this is my impression. There are lots of tragic pictures in the museum. The children, little babies, before their demise, before their death, and we have similar pictures, unfortunately. Only tears are in my eyes. This is just a tragedy. How the people are capable to do something like that, especially with the children. How can you do that to the children? Honestly speaking, I don't understand that. What's the comparison, as you say, and symbolism? Let me tell. That we can see where we are now at. This is the modern city today, which looks alive. It's important with the respect of the people to the values. And these are the pictures of the tragedies of Hiroshima and what we can see today. So I consider that the same will take place in Bakhmut and other our cities and settlements and villages and so on. Definitely it will be like that. Unfortunately today it's a tragedy, but in the future there will be reconstruction and recovery.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida deliberately chose Hiroshima as the site for this year's G7 summit. It's not only his home city, but also home to one of the most tragic events in human history, one that serves as a living reminder of what happens when nations use nuclear weapons. Kishida and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky laid wreaths at the Peace Memorial Park in Hiroshima shortly after Zelensky drew comparisons between World War II and his country's occupation by Russian forces. VOA's Arash Arabsadi has the inside story of how world leaders today grapple with nuclear deterrence for tomorrow.
August 6, 1945. In the waning days of World War II, the United States drops an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, Japan. The massive explosion killed an estimated 80,000 people. 3 days later, the U.S. drops an atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, this time killing an estimated 40,000. As he recently welcomed world leaders to the annual G7 summit, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida made known why he chose as host city his hometown of Hiroshima. Before the summit, Kishida said, "I believe the first step toward nuclear disarmament is to provide a first-hand experience of the consequences of the atomic bombing and to firmly convey the reality. The reality of death and destruction is history repeating itself in Bakhmut, Ukraine," says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
I will tell you frankly that the photos of destroyed Hiroshima absolutely remind me of Bakhmut and other such cities. There's absolutely nothing alive and all the buildings are destroyed. There is not even an understanding of where the street is and where the building is. It is simply an absolute, total destruction.
Russia is a nuclear state, and it has on more than one occasion threatened Ukraine and others with overwhelming force. But it's not alone in nuclear saber-rattling. For nearly 40 years, North Korea has threatened its southern neighbor with missile tests in what's become an evolving nuclear program. It has among the world's largest militaries and has been liberal with threats of force. Flanked by the South Korean president, U.S. President Joe Biden recently had this to say about the North.
A nuclear attack by North Korea against the United States or its allies or partisans or partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of whatever regime were to take such an action.
The two leaders announced plans to dock U.S. nuclear-armed submarines in South Korea for the first time in more than 4 decades. As part of the so-called Washington Declaration, South Korea would refrain from developing its own nuclear program. The U.S. military had already begun deployment to the region before the White House meeting. For years, the dominant deterrence policy has been mutually assured destruction. By that principle, a nuclear attack on a nuclear state or its allies would result in an overwhelming counterattack that would obliterate both the aggressor and the attacked. For now, though, the two countries who know the most about the use and the after effects of nuclear weapons, the United States and Japan, both say global disarmament is the goal. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
As world leaders gathered in Japan for the G7 summit, attention is turning to the ongoing struggle for press freedom in Hong Kong. Pro-democracy campaigner and media mogul Jimmy Lai has been at the forefront of this fight and recently spoke to members of the U.S. Congress about his father's imprisonment.
Hong Kong authorities are holding media mogul and pro-democracy campaigner Jimmy Lai in prison ahead of his trial this fall, wherein he will face sedition and other charges under Hong Kong's controversial national security law. The charges stem from his work as publisher of the now shuttered but once wildly popular pro-democracy newspaper, Apple Daily. His son Sebastian Lai testified in Washington before a Congressional Select Committee on China on May 11th. He called on lawmakers and the U.S. government to do everything possible to secure his father's release.
We expect he will face a lengthy sentence and possibly life in prison. This could mean I never see my father again. The authorities are cracking down hard on my father to send a message to him and others. Dissent will not be tolerated. There is no freedom of press.
Jimmy Lai's international legal team and Sebastian Lai met with VOA. Lai said his father came to Hong Kong from China as a boy with nothing, but rose to billionaire status.
Dad's 75 and he's in jail at the moment, and I haven't seen him in 2 years. So some part of me is obviously very worried about him. But the other part is awe. Like the respect I have for this person. This is someone who was, for his principles, was willing to give up everything that he's built.
Sebastian Lai and his father's legal team are concerned about Hong Kong's 2020 national security law, which makes it easier to prosecute protesters. They say that it is designed to quiet dissension and that international businesses operating in Hong Kong should take notice. Keelan Gallagher is Jimmy Lai's attorney.
I don't think Hong Kong is a great place to do business. Under the national security law, all it takes is for a suspicion by the executive, with no court oversight whatsoever, that one of your employees may have committed an offence. And that's sufficient to trigger a whole range of powers, freezing accounts, arresting executives, surveillance of employees. It's very worrying.
The United States, United Kingdom, European Union, and global human rights groups have spoken out against the national security law, which targets terrorism, subversion, secession, and collusion with foreign forces. China says the law, imposed after 2019's anti-government protests, has brought much-needed calm and stability to Hong Kong. Sebastian Lai, who lives in Taiwan, says he is concerned about what he calls the long arm of Hong Kong's national security law.
It's extraterritorial, so it's not just in Hong Kong. You could basically break the national security law anywhere in the world. Now, do I worry? Yeah, but it's my father. I'm still going to do what I'm going to do.
Jimmy Lai's national security law trial is set for September. Laurel Bowman, VOA News, Washington.
Before we leave you this week, a story about an international team of volunteer doctors. helping to heal the scars of some of Ukraine's children. For these kids, much-needed surgeries have not been available in Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion last year. But now, that's changing, and the procedures are free of charge. Correspondent Lisa Bakalets visited the hospital in Poland where this is all happening. She has this report.
At the end of the corridor in Ward 10, 16-year-old Yegor from the central Ukrainian city of Alexandria is waiting for surgery. Doctors will fix scars in his neck. He cannot move his head well because of them. His mother, Tatiana, is at his side.
Everything will be fine, my son. Don't worry.
Yegor has many tattoos. They partially cover the scars left after an incident 4 years ago.
I was 12 years old when I received an electric shock of 27,000 volts. 55% of my body was burned.
Yegor couldn't even count how many surgeries he has had. But from the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the boy has had none.
We don't have planned operations in Ukraine now because the war started, and almost all hospitals are filled with military personnel, so there are only emergency surgeries.
So when Tatiana heard about the initiative involving American doctor Gennady Fuzailov, she immediately submitted an application. Gennady Fuzailov is the founder of the organization Doctors Collaborating to Help Children. Since 2010, he has been traveling to Ukraine to operate on children with burn injuries for free. This year, because of the war, Dr. Fuzailov found an opportunity to bring his team of 11 specialists to Poland.
I'm very proud of my team. These people are very ambitious, productive, great surgeons who practice at Harvard and Michigan Medical School, two leading schools in America, and they took vacations to come here.
Surgeon David Brown has been working with Fuzailov for almost 10 years. The work is crucial, he says, because the children's burn injuries require constant new surgeries.
Because as they grow, the scars don't grow. And so the scars squeeze and restrict how they can move their arms or use their hands or open their mouths. It's not just about how the scars look, which is terrible, but it's even more important how the child can move their arms and their legs and get around in society.
Doctors have operated on 19 children from different regions of Ukraine.
5 to 6 surgeries were performed on each patient, and if it were not such a set of surgeons that we brought, we would not be able to perform such complex operations on the hands, on the suturing of the nerves, tendons.
From transportation to housing to food, Dr. Fuzailov's organization paid for everything. The Polish hospital in Lechna was responsible for medical care.
We give them access to our operating rooms, to our wards, and we are providing medical staff to take care of the patients in pre-operative and post-operative periods. We took a great part of costs, and hospital is paying for this, and Polish government is paying for this.
Ukrainian doctors take care of the rehabilitation of young patients after surgery. Plastic surgeon Artem Posunko has treated many of them at a hospital in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. 4 other Ukrainian doctors traveled to Poland with him. To him, the exchange of expertise is priceless.
We read the same books and articles, but they do something differently than we do. How can you reduce the time of the operation? How can you do less trauma and do exactly what was planned? This is very important, first of all, for our young patients.
All 3 teams of doctors, US, Polish and Ukrainian, say that logistics proved to be the most challenging part of this mission. But the process has already been worked out, so all participants hope to perform the operations next year. Lesia Bakalets for VOA News, Lechna, Poland.
That's all for now. Stay up to date with all the news at voanews.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News. Follow me on Twitter at 6ArmsPowell. Catch up on past episodes on our free streaming service, VOA Plus. For all those behind the scenes who brought you today's show, I'm Anita Powell. We'll see you next week for The Inside Story.